Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my June 2026 reading wrap-up video. We are now over a week into July, and so I'm talking about all the books I started in June, and a couple of them I just finished, so I feel like I'm relatively behind. Also, I'm filming at a time where I have less time, so I'm hoping I can actually make this into a shorter video. I've talked about a handful of these books earlier in June in my Am Reading videos, so I could maybe breeze through them a little more quickly. And then I have two completely new books to talk about as well. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first book I started and finished last month was The Faith of Beasts by James S.A. Corey. This I read as an anticipated 2026 read. It's a sequel. I talked about it in my mid-year check-in freakout tag as the sequel to a sci-fi series by these authors that go under James S.A. Corey together. And yeah, I really liked it. I think it's unusual, I think, for me, my favorite book of the month to be the first book, but in this case it definitely is. And so in this sci-fi universe, we're following humans who live on the planet of Qian, although there's some hints that maybe they came from elsewhere. And they are taken over by this brutal alien race called the Carricks. And the Carricks after killing an eighth of the population, add humans to their collection of aliens who they use to sort of wage a forever war, because they're a very warring species. And so in the last book we were following a bunch of biologists who were set these tasks, I think particularly to try to find a food group for an alien species. And basically it was a big test about, if they had any utility for the war effort. And in this book, a lot of the biology skills are indeed helpful to what they want, but the group of biologists is split up. Our main character is Daffod. He was kind of a Nepo baby, and now he's the one out of all of the biologists who's like the least of an egghead and kind of knows the most how to sort of grease the wheels with people in power. So that's how he becomes kind of like the conduit between the Carricks and the humans. I joked about, calling him middle management because I work in middle management, and about how he has to make two groups of, humans or species who don't get along work together somehow. I mean, in essence, he kind of takes on the face of the enemy in, furthering their agenda, but that's because humans are so outmatched that, if they don't play ball, it's just going to be pure genocide. I mean, complete wipeout of us. So he's doing that in the foreground, but also in the background, he is fermenting the idea of rebellion. And there's some really interesting ways that goes about, how narratives can be created. They are looking at, future generations. This is going to be a pretty long-term series. I'm kind of surprised that James S.A. Corey, Ty Frank and Daniel Abramson said that the next book will be the last one, because I don't know. They must be kidding us with that. This has to be Expanse level, right? I mean, it's too much is going on here. I haven't even gotten to any of the other characters who are far-flung in other parts of the war effort to give us a broader sense of what exactly is going on here and how humans fit into it. And so yeah, I enjoy the characters and I really enjoy the themes, and I'm already looking forward to the next one. Next, I finished As a Jew by Sara Hurwitz. This is a nonfiction book about Judaism, and particularly about approaching anti-Semitism and sort of the narratives of outsiders and how they, try to blame, shame, and erase, which I, listened to on audio. And it's actually, I guess, a companion, well, not a companion, but Sara Hurwitz, she actually was a speechwriter for the Obamas, and she wasn't very religious. She had kind of an epiphany in her 30s where she returned to Judaism, and she wrote this book, Here All Along, which is sort of about the realizing as adults what Judaism can offer versus sort of the very droll religious education that's unfortunate many Jews get, especially in America. Well, that's her experience and my experience, and she discovered a much deeper richness to the religion, and so that book was really very moving. I feel like this book can't be as much because it is about, centering anti-Semitism and centering, prejudicial narratives that exist outside of the community. And Sara Hurwitz, as somebody who, was less connected to Judaism growing up, she kind of had, this was the second part of her reckoning was, sort of the outsider narratives that she let influence her. And she took a deep dive into what anti-Semitism is and how it manifests. And then it just has a special sort of resurgence after October 7th as well. Although she goes much further back into the history of, 2,000 years, particularly centering on how, the rise of Christendom sort of inculcated a lot of anti-Semitism, which then morphed and changed even beyond, the Enlightenment and things like that. And I think it's all useful information. Sometimes I think this broad sweep can be a little bit, simplistic to a certain degree. And also she's very individually reacting to her experience as a chaplain and having to deal with sort of these views of non-Jews about what Jewish religion is, which is a bit, speaking of an oversimplified view of Judaism, that really is a big understanding. It's something I've been thinking about lately too, about how, Judaism doesn't fit into how America understands religion. Everybody tried to cram religion into Protestantism, basically, or the Protestant mold. But Judaism is an ethno-religion. And so there's a lot that's tied to belief, but there's also a lot that's tied to history and to thousands of years of culture. And it's a small community. It's not a global religion. So, Christianity and Islam they've expanded in ways that Judaism has not. In terms of, it doesn't have an ethnic core in the same way because they're global religions. But anyway, so that's what's going on in here. And, I think there's a lot of useful information in it, but I don't think it can be as strong as Here All Along. Maybe in a large part because understanding a community through the hatred that's lobbed at it, it's always going to be a bit reductive. It's important, especially, I think, anti-Semitism is growing in terms of, violence across the world directed at Jews. So it's important to, respond and to especially bolster up our own narrative and go into our own history and learning about, who we are as a people. It's important. But at the same time, I think I've always had trouble with, centering, that sort of reactive experience too much. So, where's the line? But this was an important read. So next I went on to Marry Me by Midnight by Felicia Grossman. This was the book I chose for my quarterly TBR game, the BookTube Spin, quarter 2. A Jewish romance novel that's Regency era, so I was pretty excited for it because I have a lot of trouble with contemporary romance. I don't buy into the world as much. And I was much more hopeful about this, and I do think that it worked a lot better for me. I enjoyed the characters and the situations more, although I don't think I fell head over heels either. I feel like there was too much going on. It feels like a really large book, although part of it is because of this annoying mass market paperback size. But anyway, so this is the start of sort of a Jewish Regency fairy tale series because it's sort of a retelling of Cinderella, gender bent. So we're following Isabel Lyra. She's a Sephardic Jew in the Regency era, meaning that her community has been living in England for the past couple generations, ever since England invited Jews back, and particularly a lot of Sephardic Jews who were fleeing the Inquisition and, had a stopover in Amsterdam, but they took this up. And her community, she's part of a community that has accumulated some wealth, but they don't have full citizenship, so that is something in the background about, can we, encourage the Gentiles to see us like people and, give us full citizenship, which is somewhat in flux, especially as more Ashkenazi Jews in this new generation who are much more impoverished and less culturally assimilated and fleeing from pogroms are coming in. And so that's our boyfriend material. Our Cinderella man is Aaron Ellenberg, who is an Ashkenazi orphan who also can't seem to find his way into, a career, into family life. And Isabel Lyra has to marry in part because her father died, and she's the heir to his business, and he has business partners, the Barab family, and she sees them as an antagonistic relationship with her, and so she needs a husband to basically stand for her interests. And she uses Aaron basically as, well, the first idea is to use him as a spy to like give her the dirt on her possible suitors that she's also meeting during this series of balls between various Jewish festivals. But it quickly devolves into the extreme sexual relationship, attraction between the two of them, and there's some steamy scenes on the page where they're sneaking around doing the deed, but in like the back of their head they're like, oh well, we're going to stop this, we have our own personal agendas to get to. But of course, it's a romance, so it's about them finally learning how they should get married and they should get to it. They have some help from some figures somewhat inspired by Cinderella, particularly a interesting fairy godmother sort of figure that comes into the picture. So I enjoy this. I even do think I might try to continue on with this series because there's some other characters who we follow in this story who are going to get their own romances, and I do think historical works better for me than contemporary if I'm going to continue on with romance reading, so we shall see. Next, I have Our Little Histories by Janice Weizman. This was my Buzzwordathon pick for June. And so this is historical fiction that takes place largely starting in basically the middle of the 19th century and then moving into the modern day, but it's told first it's told in backward fashion. We start with a contemporary storyline and then move backward. They're basically vignettes told by members of this sprawling family, and we start with these distant cousins who kind of don't know much about their history anymore, but one of them works with museums, and she's contacted by this rich Belarusian guy who wants her to do sort of a living exhibit with the descendants of Ashkenazi Jews who descended from the Belarusian area, which is actually her family and my family. And so she encourages her Israeli cousins to basically take on these roles of 18th, 19th century shtetl people. And as this is happening, they're talking about some shared family lore and this collection of poetry from 1917 they both have, and they're realizing that, this, circus type play they're putting on isn't really telling the whole story. And so that's how the next chapters going back further in history go forth. But to start at the beginning, there's these three triplets who basically divide into three branches of the family, and one branch ultimately moves to Israel during the Mandate of Palestine era, so we follow a few of those descendants during the War for Independence and during the 60s. And then we're following one other American, member. We have the one who's, the museum person in the modern day, and then we have a member from the 1930s. And then we're following a little bit of, the branch that stayed in Belarusia and the Lithuania area. At the time, it was going from the Russian Empire into the future, into the 20th century. And that line was, completely cut off, by the Holocaust, was wiped out. But we're getting a lot of the history. I mean, a lot of the vignettes in Israel and America are about how and why the family are losing their history and their knowledge of Yiddish as they're trying to assimilate into these new Jewish cultures, or, Jewish-esque cultures, I guess, because in America we have an assimilation that's, beyond Judaism, and Israel was sort of trying to create a new Judaism. And then we go back to the past in Belarusia and the Russian Empire, and we learn a fair bit more about, the revolutionary thought, which some of the members were there for, about how, and that was sort of a break from religious tradition for a lot of Jews. And then the final storyline, which is really about how these three brothers separate, is because their mother is desperate to save them from the Tsar's army, which really heavily targeted Jews to try to sort of break down their, ethnic ties and religious ties. And so she wrote the poem that was ultimately passed down to her descendants, and it was basically to remind her three sons of their, heritage, because she had to split them up to save them. And so I found this really moving. I have a bias because I'm also very interested in this history, and I don't have as much of it in my personal family. Well, I don't know as much of it in my personal family history, but this could fit the bill of what my family was going through, because this is what most Jews in that area were going through at the time when my family lived there. So yeah, and also, it is a small press book, and I thought, so it's nice that the writing worked pretty well for me, and yeah, I enjoyed this one. Next, we have The Calculus of Change by Jessie Hilb. This was my top of the Goodreads pick for June, meaning it was near the top of my Goodreads TBR, and it had been on the longest, so I swiped it off. This is YA fiction, which is actually has some Jewish themes in it as well. We are following Aiden. Aiden is I think she's a senior, although it feels like maybe she should be a junior because she's still not quite sure of her college plans. And she has this crush on Tate, who is this Jewish guy who came back from a Birthright Israel trip and started wearing his kippah or yarmulke around because he was feeling a sense of Jewish pride, and that awakened something in her because her mother, Aiden's mother, was Jewish, but she died of cancer about 10 years ago, and so the family dissociated from Jewish life after that. But one of the storylines in here is about Aiden reacquainting herself with her mother's Jewish community to learn more about her mother's story. Otherwise, she's dealing with attraction to Tate. She is actually his calculus tutor. He has a girlfriend as well, although he spends a lot of time with her alone, and they have a nice teasy, flirtatious relationship. And meanwhile, there's other subplots going on. Her brother is, he's an athlete, and their father is really pushing for him to, excel so that he could get a scholarship. But the brother is starting to resist, and he has a girlfriend, and he's doing some drugs, and he's just, trying to find his own way beyond what his father wants. And his father, meanwhile, their father, has never fully gotten over the death of his wife, and he can have some volatile behaviors as well. And then Aiden has a best friend who's also going through some, problematic, I guess, romances. She's involved with a teacher, actually. And so this is told in a YA style, and at first it took a while for me to get into it. It's just the chapters were too fleeting, and I was worried that this presentation was too surface level for all these issues she was putting on the page. But eventually, I think I just started to get into it more, and I was more moved by what Aiden was going through and how, things resolved and how she dealt with them. And so, I really appreciated this one at the end. Next, I listened to Qian by Madeleine Dunnigan on audio. I actually listened to a couple of others on audio, but I have physical copies for them, but anyway, that is beyond the point. This was one of my anticipated 2026 releases. So this novel takes place in the 1970s in an English boarding school, and it's about a burgeoning sexual relationship between Qian and one of his classmates. Qian is kind of a kid from the wrong side of the tracks. He's not upper class, and he's Jewish, and his mother came from Germany as an immigrant during, or after, I should say, World War II, where a lot of his family was wiped out. In all honesty, Qian isn't, so really affiliated with the community. So there's a little bit of nods that, it intrigued me to pick this book up about Judaism, but it's really much more about homosexuality and sort of that awakening of sorts, although there's some backstory stuff that I think takes away from that a bit, and I just feel like, and maybe I am biased by some other reviews I actually listened to before I started listening to this, but I feel like this is my most disappointing book because it just felt a little too fleeting for me. The characterization wasn't all the way there, and the plotting wasn't all the way there especially for an adult novel, and I wanted something a little bit more nuanced, and this one sort of, I don't know, it just kind of flitted in and out of my head a little bit. So that's why it's my most disappointing read. Slightly future Rachel here to refilm part of this video where I talk about my next book, Beautiful Country by Wang, because frankly I should take the time to at least attempt to pronounce names correctly. It's the bare minimum. Anyway, this book is a memoir. It was my page 112 tag pick for June. And it is about Wang's experience as an undocumented immigrant in the U.S. She was born in China, and then when she was a young child in the early 90s, her parents took her to the U.S. and they largely lived undocumented here, which means that she was living in poverty, that her parents were largely only finding jobs in sweatshops, under the table, and, you know, there's just a lot of hardship that goes into not having documentation and not being able to sort of get a leg up in the U.S. And so she, you know, came in not knowing any English, although it seems like she learned pretty quickly, although she had a really rocky beginning to her education in elementary school. And it talks about those years in particular because by the time she hits middle school, she and her parents finally, they moved to Canada where they have better opportunities, frankly. Although later in life, Wang moves back to the U.S. To go to school and become a lawyer. And I believe she becomes a Jew by choice, because this is actually how I learned about this memoir, is she published an essay in in one of my favorite websites, the Jewish Book Council, where she talks about Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur is a fasting holiday, and so she was relating it to her actual experiences with hunger growing up. So, you know, it's really harrowing. This is important information, and it's harrowing as a U.S. citizen to realize that there's people in my country who live this way. Though I admit I didn't glomp onto this memoir as much as I hoped. It might be because of the distance Wang had from, you know, being a child in that time period. I didn't find myself fully engrossed. Maybe it's the narrative heavy style. But, you know, it is very important, and I'm going to continue to ruminate on it as I get ready to write my Goodreads review. And my final read of the month, I think it was my May page 112 tag pick, was The Space Between Us by Thrity Umrigar. So I'm caught up with page 112 tag now, huzzah! This is a novel. It takes place in India. We're following two women who are actually mistress and servant living in modern day Bombay. And it's about, you know, well, there's a present day storyline, and then she dives back into the past to sort of really dive deep into the relationship between these two women and how they looked out for each other in really unconventional ways. Like there's a sort of a classist sheen over the top of it about how you know, surprising it is that Sara, who's the mistress, you know, is this involved and cares this much about Bhima, who is her servant. And part of that reason is because of what I read in the page 112 tag, is that Sara was privately being physically abused by her husband, and Bhima was privately taking care of her. And then there were a lot of ways where Sara looked after Bhima during some really horrible hardships of her own. I feel like a secondary title to this book might be All Men Are Assholes. Just, I don't know, I think there might be one person in this rather sad tale, one man who was a good man, and he was helping Bhima, who had to go to Delhi at one point because her daughter and son-in-law contracted AIDS. And speaking of which, her daughter got AIDS through her son-in-law, you know, straying, philandering. And Bhima is this incredibly uneducated woman who cannot read or write, and she's treated like crap by everybody because of that, and she has very little idea of what's going on. And I mean, in terms of like really understanding a lot of things that an education might teach you. And so the one nice man was someone who was helping her as her son-in-law and daughter were dying in the hospital. But otherwise, the men in here are awful. We have Sara's husband, who was abusive. We have Bhima's husband, who was swindled after a work accident and turned to drink and ultimately abandoned the family and took her son with her. And so men are kind of awful in this. And then in the present day storyline where, we go back into the past to understand the relationship between these women and their lives, in part to really get a sucker punch when it comes to a present day storyline where Bhima's taking care of her granddaughter after her daughter passes. And her granddaughter is on her way to a better future, in part because Sara pulls strings for her to get into college. But Maya ends up pregnant, and she, throughout the book is insistent about hiding the truth of who the father is. But obviously, this could have horrible consequences for her in Indian culture about what might happen to her. Ultimately, she does get an abortion, and surprisingly, she shows a lot of animosity towards Sara about it. And we do get into understanding at the end who the father actually is, and it feels like a sucker punch, because up to that point, that character, who the father is, seemed like a pretty decent guy. Like, looking back on it, the author put in some things about him being a bit of a jerk sometimes, but not to a huge extent until we realize what happened to get her pregnant. And it severs a lot of things. And actually there is a second book. I don't know if it follows Sara, but I think it follows Bhima, who, is cast adrift after the events of this book. And it's a bit tragic, a lot of things end and a lot of things are severed after this book, and these two women particularly had such a strong relationship, but the men keep interfering and doing awful things, and sometimes it can bring them together and sometimes it drives them apart, I guess. But there's something a little, I guess, soap opera-ish about it, I suppose, or some of the writing I thought was a little purple, but I also was really moved by the story and the characters as well. And that about covers it for me now. I'm sure I talk more than I hope to. Hopefully I can squeeze in editing and posting this. And speaking of squeezing things in, I would like to be back on this channel within the next couple of days with my first AM reading video of July, which means I have to get into my July reading, so I have something to talk about. Will that happen? Stay tuned. I hope you all don't feel quite so behind on your reading and writing goals and your booktube goals as I am at the moment, but I suppose we'll muddle through this. And in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.